The E60 M5 is a bit of a legend in the car world, isn't it? Wedging a massive 5-litre V10 under the bonnet of a family car was always going to be pretty hilarious, and it's something I don't imagine will ever happen again. This is actually my first time driving one, thanks to Dara, an ex-F1 mechanic who runs everything M3s. Now, they are the guys to know when it comes to BMWs, and if you ever see an M3 CSL with a manual conversion, there's a good chance they did it. In fact, they did the conversion for the manual CSL I drove against the C63 Black Series a year or so ago. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. Now, it's no surprise that the first impressions are that that engine is truly special. It's really unique, the noise it makes, but despite all the love the E60 M5 gets these days, its reception wasn't necessarily quite as warm when it came out back in 2005. The iDrive system was still driving people up the wall or even into a wall because it was that distracting. And after the pretty much perfect looking E39, I don't think the world was really ready for Bangle's crazy styling on this car. And then there was an issue perhaps even more clunky than the iDrive. After the manual-only E39, apart from in the US, the E60 was only available with an SMG automated manual gearbox. And being from 2005, it's not that bad. It's maybe not as bad as I expected, but it kind of prevents you from quite connecting with that engine how you really want to. But this isn't the only car that Dara's brought with him today. As if by magic, you join me in the other car Dara's brought along today. And instead of being a family saloon with a 5-litre V10 up front, this is a family estate with a 5-litre V10 up front. Arguably even cooler. But more importantly, yep, Dara has swapped the original SMG gearbox for a good old-fashioned 6-speed manual. In a few weeks, this car is going to be on a ship to Hong Kong, but for today, we have permission to drive it as we please. So let's find out why the Americans were so smug about getting a stick-shift M5, shall we? Gearbox aside, under the bonnet, this has lovely carbon fibre E-Venturi air intakes, which make a lovely noise as well. Otherwise, it's as it left the factory, so we've got a smidge over 500 horsepower, 520 newton meters of torque, and it's all made really high up the rev range, so going flat there at 4,000 RPM, it goes, the response is very quick, but if you want that 500 horsepower, you're way up, 8,000 RPM, all the way to a red line at around 8,500, it absolutely screams up there. Heel and toeing into the corners in an M5. Alright, the E39 was manual, but it kind of feels like this shouldn't be. It's really cool and novel. But we'll get onto the gearbox in a bit. Back in the day, you might remember the E60 M5 would quite famously do over 200 miles an hour with the limiter removed. I mean, that was mad in 2005. Did it feel fast today? When the traction control stops fighting, yeah, it does. Let's wind it out. It just revs and revs and revs and revs, and it just keeps going. I think that's the thing with this car. Rather than the initial punch in the back, it's just relentless at the top end. I seem to be saying this quite a lot recently, driving these slightly older, naturally aspirated cars, but it is a nice amount of power. Easy to modulate, feels fast, but you can enjoy it. You can actually get your foot flat. And the M5 Touring weighs about 1900 kilos, so It's fairly hefty, but when you compare it to some of the modern counterparts, it's not bad at all. And BMWs from this era were a little notorious for having chocolate brakes, and you know what? On a single stop at least, they hurl it down well. The other car Darrag's brought with him today has got upgraded brakes, which suggests to me it's an area he does think needs improvement, but I think unless you're absolutely pounding around a track and going at them over and over, which I don't think you would in this car, they feel more than up to the job. Now, if you looked at this thing, a big estate car, you wouldn't exactly think the handling was its thing. You wouldn't think it wants to do a road like this. You know what? It feels like it does to me. We're in the M mode on the steering wheel, which gives us the full fat 500 brake, and it's put the EDC in its middle setting as well. So it's a little firmer, not too wallowy, but it also means it can soak up the bumps of a British B road as well, so I'm not being thrown all over the place. Even in these slightly damp conditions, the front end's great, and I've got a surprising amount of confidence in it. And every time you come out of a corner, you have that engine again. It kind of flows really nicely down a road. And then heel and towing a big V10 in an M5. Anyway, I've got so absorbed in driving this thing, I've not really spoken about why we're here. The gearbox. Well, what I can tell you straight away is the way the guys at Everything M3s have integrated it is spot on. You know, if you got in here, it looks totally OEM. Excuse me. You can sort of tell that BMW didn't intend for the E60 to be manual too often, other than maybe in some of the basic 520s, because most of the 5 Series will have been autos, and almost all the M5s, other than in the US, were SMGs. So it's quite far forward for a manual. It's a bit of a reach into first. No biggie when you get going. And to use, well, it feels like a BMW gearbox. And by that I mean it's not the absolute best, but it's good. It does feel nice. And these days, to be honest, it's just kind of nice to be using any manual. But no, it is good. The big question for me is, does it suit it? Does a big, sort of comfy estate car that's really a bit of a Grand Tourer suit having a manual? Well, on this road at least, yeah, it does. I mean, on this road, I'm absolutely loving it. And until this point, every M5 had been manual, so it doesn't really seem like that weird a thing to do. Using it day to day, who knows? But I think anyone who buys a car like this is buying it for a special occasion sort of car anyway, something they're going to enjoy driving like this. And like I said, the SMG, it's not too bad. It's not like as horrendous as the Rapid gets, but it's the weakest link of the car, and for me, this solves that. By solving that, it transforms the whole experience. It feels like a proper driver's car. The thing I'll say about the E60 M5, which is exactly what Darragh told me before I got into it, he says they want to be driven hard. They just ask for it, and they do. And they reward you for doing it. In that the chassis feels great on this sort of road. They really do come alive when you drive them hard, and obviously, the most obvious point, the engine, you just get to hear it, and you get to experience the power at the top end. I have driven an F90 M5, and obviously, goes without saying, it would destroy this in every single way, especially in these conditions today. But this has got soul. Now that pretty much everything's a turbocharged V6 or turbocharged V8 in the case of the M5, you don't get something that screams like that. And it's that is the reason why, no matter how frigid the reception might have been from certain people when this car came out, that is why now, 16, 17 years later, why it's a legend, and I think it always will be. It's the V10 M5, isn't it? There was never another one, there never will be another one. It's an absolute icon and it deserves it. I feel like the E60 M5 has only got better as time's passed. After the criticism of the styling at the time, I actually think the E60 has aged well and even looks pretty attractive in the right spec. The cabin hasn't stood the test of time quite so well. It's solid but just a bit drab. Though if this era wasn't exactly the high point for BMW's interior styling, I'd argue that it absolutely was for their engines. The SMG cars have the DSC button on the SMG selector surround, so to retain the function of the button rather than delving into the iDrive to configure it, it just needs to be installed in the centre console where it would be on a factory manual car, and this hadn't been done at the time of filming. All day though, on the way out of every single bend, I kept coming back to that engine. It's silky smooth when you're setting off at low speed, the induction bark builds from about 4,000 RPM before the iconic wail takes over all the way to the red line at 8,250 RPM. Sure, it lacks the low-down punch of the modern turbocharged engines, but get the revs high and you're rewarded with a proper turn of pace and the most unique sound. The rarer estates like this one are a bit more expensive, but you can get a decent M5 saloon in the early £20,000 range right now. Add on 6,000 plus VAT for the conversion, and you have a future classic the way it really should have left the factory for around 30 grand. To put that into perspective, a new 520D is touching 40. Alright, I'm sure it won't be cheap to run, although Dara tells me they're not as scary as people make out if they're well looked after. Most importantly though, a manual E60 M5 is something hardly anyone has. Something that's an absolute joy to drive, and something it's safe to say no manufacturer will ever replicate again.